Welcome to Board Certified, expert interview episodes about medical licensing exams and healthcare careers. I'm Cassandra with Achievable, and we offer affordable adaptive online prep courses for the USMLE Step 1, MCAT, PTCE, MPTE, CSCS, and others. Each course contains everything you need to succeed, including comprehensive study guides, video lessons, thousands of practice questions powered by our memory-enhancing algorithm, and full-length practice exams. And you can try any course for free at achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to save 10%. Now let's get started. So today we have Conor Heeney with us, and Conor, I'd love if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks for the invite, first and foremost. I'm Conor. I'm the Performance Sports Science Coordinator at Liverpool John Moores University. I'm an accredited strength and conditioning coach. I've been working in sport, an elite sport for the past sort of 10, 11 years. Worked with pretty much every type of athlete, worked with about 50 different sports across those 10 years, whether it be youth, masters, Olympic, Paralympic, para athletes. So hopefully I think we're probably going to get into a few of those populations and talk all things coaching and all things athletic development, which I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like you said, today's episode is going to be about the different coaching concepts based on different demographics that you work with. To start things off, let's start with the young folks, right? How do youth athletes differ from obviously professional athletes? That's quite a jump, but even just adults, what training philosophies differ, what are the same? And I'm also thinking that communication style is going to differ a lot too. So can you walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think an important point to raise about working with youth athletes is understanding there's no such thing as a professional kid athlete. Professional athletes get paid. They're part of that organization. They have to turn up and they have to do this, that, and the other, and they're part of they're essentially an asset to the team. There's no such thing as professional 10-year-old, 12-year-old, 14-year-old. They just don't really exist. So we need to treat that and understand that before we even get into it, because you look at sort of the rates in terms of kids going into elite sport, and I think in the Premier League in the UK, it's roughly around 1% of academy kids go into first team level sport in the first 5 tiers. So you've got to appreciate that, yes, we are trying to develop the 1% to be able to get there, but the appreciation also needs to be for the other 99% that aren't going to make it. And how can we do that as best as possible? The things you might need to consider, obviously, with education and things that happen with that. And the university degree programs do it really well, and high school programs do it really well. But I just think that's a sort of overarching comment to make about try not as best you can to force professionalism among kids that may never make it into that elite level. It's more important to instill character traits into those elements, not necessarily if you don't make it, you're going to be a little bit of a failure. So I think about, if we're talking about physical development, we typically tend to think, especially with younger kids, it's all about the fundamentals and a big sort of emphasis on the fun side of things. Because what realistically you want with these kids is you want them to be engaged in sport for the rest of their life, essentially. So if and it goes back to the first point, if you're putting so much pressure on them, and especially that relates to female athletes, there's a huge dropout of female athletes, especially once they turn 14 and go into high school or whatnot, because it just ends up not being an environment which is fun, engaging, or something they do. So it's essentially, how can we encourage kids how can we make that base level of sport as big as it can be? And the bigger the base, the higher the peak, in terms of, you have a greater pool of athletes that are going into the next level of sport and the next level. You should have a better sort of population working at that top end. But realistically, it's especially from an S&C side perspective, it's just giving them all the foundational level movements, the primal movements. Can they do simple things? Can they run properly? Can they crawl? Can they fall? Can they hop? I think that's been taken a little bit out of the sort of curriculum with a lot of schools. The physical development side of things has completely been taken out. We might get 1 to 2 hours of physical activity a day. So it's trying to give them a very diverse range of skills at which then they can go, okay, maybe I don't want to be an American football athlete, but I was doing this thing with tennis and I absolutely loved it, or we were doing this rock climbing stuff and that was really cool, or gymnastics and I loved that. So it's about trying to encourage and expose youth athletes to as many different of sport, whether it's hand-eye coordination, whether it's calisthenics, bodyweight stuff, whether it be collision-based sports, whether it be more chase-based sports or whatever it might be. So giving them a really big foundation, I think that's probably the part where you want to focus and adding in that fun element as much as you can to physical development.
Yeah, I think that's a great point and a really important distinction that you made. Kids are kids, they're not professionals. Maybe they'll be part of that 1%, but that's years away. So, really having that distinction, I think, is important because there's a certain way that I think you need to be communicating with youth athletes and just children in general that is probably going to look a lot different when you're talking to someone who's a client who, is getting paid and is responsible for performing at a certain level, right? These kids are not, they're not doing that. And you emphasized having fun with it. And I think that's the most important thing.
And that doesn't really change as they go through. Like a 16-year-old wants to have fun, an 18-year-old wants to have fun, a 21-year-old. And some of the best programs that I see at the elite level, you can see every one of those athletes, they want to be there. They're enjoying the process. There's obviously a serious element to that, but coaches are delivering in a way where they can get high energy, high impact with their athletes because the athletes are enjoying what they do. And you've got to remember, athletes are competitors at heart, and the best way to have competition is to play games. So it doesn't have to be anything too serious. What you've got to try and think about as an SSC coach is taking the principles of athletic development and putting that in ways that engage and encourage and make athletes solve problems and they're competing against the person next to them. And that's how over time you build that, build that, build that. And you will get really good athletes at the end of the day. Like if you want an athlete to have burnout, get them to do the same sport from the age of 8 years old all the way to 20, and you'll have an athlete who's lost love in the sport for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, at a certain point, that fun kind of transitions into passion, right? Like you have to have a passion if you're going to do this long term. And the older you get, the more that passion encompasses things like discipline. Because youth athletes probably aren't the best when it comes to, oh, I need to make sure I do this exercise or practice these skills. They kind of have to be told to do those things versus the older you get, you instill that into yourself if you have that passion and if you want to remain doing what is fun for you.
Do absolutely. And I think there was a great point in the Simone Biles documentary where once she went through that period where she was struggling to perform, a big part of it was I just want to enjoy being in the gym again. And that was it. That was essentially the first thing. And there wouldn't be anything worse for a parent to feel like they're forcing their kids to turn up on the field of the court or whatnot. They actively want the kids to enjoy sport because we want kids in sport, just for the kid themselves, but across the country, people being in sport is sort of the main agenda. So if we can support that, that's fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious how you foster that fun when you're working with youth athletes. And as a coach, how do you recognize specific skills from individuals and help them grow that while still implementing that fun aspect?
Yeah, it's probably going to depend on the level of athlete that you're working with, but it still follows a process of, even if you're working with athletes that within the same group, there's high level and there's lower level athletic ability, you can still find ways to either partner them up or group them up so that they're still competing with people at their sort of level and doing games at their level. And it's almost like if you're working with a youth setup, it's not always doing the same drills all the time. Like, why can't we focus on a little bit of balance, or why can't we do a mobility focused engagement drill? Or it's about understanding the group that you're working with and trying as best you can to understand their character, what they want. Do they want to be singled out and saying, oh, you need to do better, or are they a little bit shyer and they just want a little arm on the shoulder to be encouraged that way? So yeah, I suppose it depends on the group you're with and understanding just the ability levels and not potentially putting two people at completely other ends of the spectrum and going, okay, you compete, and that's only just going to end up in no one having good times. But again, it depends what you foster within that group. Is it a results based program or is it a performance and enjoyment based program? So are you more, did we win on the weekend or how did we play on the weekend? What are the things that I wanted you to work on? Did you do them? So you can do it in a load of different ways. So a lot of sports do that better than others. So you think with track and field based sports where it's just time, so you essentially competing against yourself. So okay, here's some drills that are going to work on certain things. If you do that in the race, okay, fantastic. And then that gives them that confidence boost. Or whether it's within a team setting and they might not be the best athlete in the team, but okay, all I want you to do is really focus on outside of your foot and then play it directly into the winger's feet. And if they do that 3 or 4 times in the game, wow, that's amazing. We don't have to talk about them letting in 5 goals. There's some really key things that we can do with that. But I suppose that just goes down to the coaching side of it and knowing players.
I think just to segue into working with adults and working with non-professional athletes. So I'm assuming these are people who maybe hire a personal trainer. They're just looking to get better at fitness or work towards certain fitness goals. Can you talk a little bit about that? And what are the scenarios in which you're working with non-professional adult, I guess not really even athletes, but maybe athletes, just non-professional?
Yeah. So I wouldn't have the biggest experience. Obviously, early in my career, I worked with every single person I could get my hands on. So I haven't really worked with general pop for a few years, but I suppose it doesn't really change too much. It's just the motivations change. So it's understanding what their motivations are. Why are they turning up to the gym? What is it that they want from this? If it's more of a social aspect, okay, then you can encourage that within the gym, maybe bring in other people. Or if it's more of a aesthetics based or body composition based goal, then really understanding that and how we can support them with that. And a lot of the time it's educating them as to why they're doing the things that they're doing. Because maybe I'm different because like with athletes and I want to encourage them and empower them to do things themselves. But if I was working with someone, I would want them to know exactly the reason for the exercise and why it's in the program related to the motivations that they told me in that initial consultation or assessment. So it's always referring it back to why are you here in the first place and what am I doing as a coach to support you with that session after session. Not putting too much pressure on it because then it becomes a little bit too outcome orientated. But let's think about the process and let's think about things of still educating them. There's ups and downs, and some days they might come in and they're under the weather, but the consistency element and everything like that. So a lot of it when working with general population is that education element because they haven't had that before and they might be misinformed through social media or whatnot, and they might not understand that if their progress is good progress or bad progress. So half of it's education, and then the second half of it is understanding motivation and building that into your programs and things.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, general population, they might be juggling a full-time job, they have a family, they have kids. So, what's some advice to stick with that consistency and maintain that motivation? Because I feel like that's a lot of people's downfall is I'm too busy, right?
Sure. Yeah, and I suppose that all comes down to that initial consultation that you have with someone, whether that's really formal or a little bit less formal. So it's always when working with someone, what is the lowest hanging fruit that we can at least get you to do on somewhat of a consistent basis? Because success breeds success, and the feeling and the dopamine and the serotonin that you get from, okay, I achieved something. For the past 10 years, I have been just getting worse and worse and worse. It's been eating away at me, but I just can't feel that I've been getting better. But now that you almost give them a little target, and then that target goes into the next one and the next one, because going from 0 to 50 is a lot more daunting. It's almost unfair on the individual, because if I've already told you that can't do. I really struggle with committing to 5 sessions a week, and you go, no, right, what we need is discipline, and you just need to attack it. You 5 sessions a week, but that's what you need. And they might have a wedding, and they can only do 4 sessions that week. Does that mean that that's a bad week? No. What I always try and encourage is understanding the slow and fast weeks. A week where you've hit all 3 sessions and you've done an amazing job, that's a really fast week. You're going to get to your goals a little bit quicker. If you've only done 1 session, it's just a slower week. You're still moving in the right direction. It's just going to be a little bit slower. So it's potentially changing the language of success and fail to maybe that progression of we're progressing really fast, or this isn't a bad thing. It's just let's get back on track. You're allowed off days. So that is important as long as it relates to the motivations. Because if you're working with an elderly person and they want to make sure that they can hold their grandkids till they're 70, 75 years old, okay, what I need you to be able to do that is we've got these exercises. If you can just set aside 20 minutes a week just to do these few things, and then we can build on that, that's going to help you be able to pick up, whoever later into your age. So link it back to the goals, link it back to the motivations, find the lowest hanging fruit, and then build it from there.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I think there is this myth around consistency having to be every single day, 2 to 3 hours a day. And if you're not doing that, then give up, basically.
Yeah.
And I think that's not really how progress is achieved, right? Going back to what you said about the burnout before. I mean, that's just as true for adults as it is for youth athletes or just kids. And understanding that just showing up and making realistic achievements, like you said, having that initial consultation. Where are you at right now, right? Maybe you're not at 5 days a week, but maybe you want to strive for that. But let's maybe start with 2, or maybe you're at 20 minutes a week, and that's fine. And I think just having that understanding so you're not, setting them up for failure is really helpful in helping them achieve their goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the time it's not actually, it's arguably not beneficial for the PT to be saying, we'll do a 20-minute session. I only want you to come in once every 2 weeks. But if that's the best thing for the individual, then surely that should be what we should be encouraging. But sometimes the fact that it's somewhat of a selfish entity because you need to pay your bills, I can understand why there is slightly a greater emphasis on now let's do 5 sessions a week and let's do that every single week and whatnot. But it's trying to meet the individual where they are and build it from there, because I would much rather have a client I've worked with for 5 to 10 years than repeated clients for 6 months, for sure.
Right, exactly. And again, you're building that relationship, and that could maybe come with referrals or, like you said, long-term client versus someone who's like, I'm getting pushed too hard and I'm done, and then they're gone.
Yeah, a lot of the time as well, I think what doesn't get obviously mentioned with a lot of either practitioners or coaches is how can you show that you're effective? So we've talked about a load of different motivations that someone might have. It's almost your ability to be able to market that and showcase that. So, 2 years ago, I worked with this individual, and here's the story about that. I worked with it, and it's almost like one, you can collect stories just informally, or formal. Maybe you've got a website or you've got a channel, and you can keep sharing loads of different examples of where you've supported people with their motivations that will directly relate to potentially the next person that wants to come in for the exact same reason, or another person. So it's almost encouraging that as well from a psychological point of view, and be like, this person's very good at doing the thing I want in my life. And that loads of people have different motivations. So if it's body composition and recomping and building muscle, fantastic. Show that you can be effective at that. If it's a different reason, show that you can be effective at that and build a very good portfolio for that area of fitness that you really want to double down on.
Yeah, that's important as well. And then just changing gears a little bit and moving into the next tier, which would be the professional athletes, right? What are the differences between the general population, you know, fitness training, coaching versus these professional athletes?
So within our department and a lot of the stuff we do, we specialize in combat sports. So I work with a lot of athletes who are mildly psychotic in the fact that they will train for their whole life to sit in an octagon and look at the person across from them and want to essentially kill. Like some of the athletes we work with at
Yeah.
that sort of level. So you can be working with really special cases in terms of their approach and attitude to training because the stakes are so high. And that's not just with, your combat sports, but the stakes can be so high from essentially because you're a professional athlete, your whole income, your whole life is revolving around you either getting a contract, you either getting a sponsorship, you staying in the sport long enough to be able to get those things. So there becomes a much greater emphasis on those athletes being able to what can they do, either working with a coach or what can they do physically to be able to support them in doing that. I suppose it goes a little bit back to the motivations, but typically at the gym, a lot of my role is to actually pull athletes back instead of push them on. Different sports are different characters and choosing personalities, and even within a sport, you can have some people that need to be pushed, some people that need to be pulled. Even within the week, one day they need to be pushed, one day they need to be pulled. So again, there's that relationship, which is why personal training isn't that different from strength and conditioning training. It's just understanding an individual, understanding motivation, and understanding where they need to get to. It's just you tend to have different buckets in terms of working with different sports. So yeah, combat guys are a different sort of breed, which is why we love working with them because and we had one athlete there last week who done I think he done 19 sessions in 7 days. And I was just like, you're ridiculous. And that was the first week he came in. I was like, so we then went through some monitoring, went through some tests, and I was like, you do know your test results are down 20%. He was like, oh, I didn't know that. And so you have to educate them as well. So there's a lot of crossovers when working with general population to work with elite athletes. It just is that the stakes are much higher. And from a coaching perspective, your understanding, your knowledge, and your application needs to be far, far more precise because the stakes are so much higher and because they're probably already at a level. So we're working with percentages and the percentage of percentages. Where with general population, the goal is very general. So the training approach can be quite general at the same time. Whereas if I'm working with a golfer and I need them to be able to swing a club at a specific velocity, at a specific angle, in a specific position, I need my training, I need my understanding of the sport and the physicality of that to be so precise to be able to, for me to improve something precise, I need to have to be precise in my improvement. Does that make sense? So it's just another layer, but the principles are very, very simple.
With combat sports, that's definitely the most intense type of athlete, right? I mean, you're essentially getting punched in the face.
Sure.
And, you know, other sports, they pause the game or the match and like it's a penalty or a flag or something. So I guess I'm just curious, like, how do you handle, and this might be an absurd question, but injury prevention, or what does that recovery look like and what's the timeline for that?
Yeah, I mean, a brilliant example there is there's definitely a line of which your professional conduct you think about a lot, especially when working with professional combat athletes. We had an athlete who was 1 week away from competing for a 2 million, £3 million prize to win that fight. And he was in serious pain. So previous surgery and serious pain in his training. And we had to have a conversation about whether this athlete should continue with the training. So he was about to do a treadmill session, whether we think it's worth it, whether risk and reward, that psychologically the athlete was in a space where if he didn't complete the last training session of camp, he wouldn't have been in a position psychologically to go into that fight. So we had to make a last minute judgment decision to go, okay, let's risk £3 million here on this training session. Unfortunately, it worked out, but I suppose what the point there is that you have to make a lot of judgments as you go through because the stakes are high, and if that athlete doesn't make selection, or athlete doesn't get to the ring or the octagon, or they're not competing, does that mean they don't get the benefits that are associated with elite sport? But then if we consider, I suppose, what your question was about in terms of injury prevention, again, it just goes back to what the demands of the sport. So we talked about a part of your process of being an S&C coach is doing a needs analysis. So understanding to the minutiae, the cellular molecular mechanisms, to the biomechanics, the kinematics of sport, knowing that in a lot of detail from a demands point of view, so you can prepare the athlete for the demands of the sport. And then what you need to do through that process is understand how the athlete's getting on. We monitor them, we assess their status, assess their movement, assess their capacity. So we are trying to balance the line of development and prevention and mitigating all that together, so that we can get them in as best shape as possible without risking or putting them at risk of injury. So it's definitely a balancing act with those athletes. And the higher you go typically in the sport, the less we focus on performance or developing performance, I should say, or developing athleticism. And it's all about maintaining that athlete, keeping them in the ring, keeping them on the pitch, keeping them on the court, so that their technical, tactical ability, because more than likely their physical output is where it needs to be. It's then just keeping them tactically and technically well.
Yeah, it's almost like maintenance versus progression in a way. Like they're already at the point they need to be, but now we need to maintain that. And I think what was interesting that you mentioned was how much risk is involved as a coach to have to make these, like you said, high stakes decisions. Is this person gonna go out there when maybe they have an injury that maybe that's not the best move? Or are you gonna lose out on a big compensation? So how often do you have to make decisions like that in the professional sports world?
Yeah, I would argue every single time you see an athlete, you make a decision. Whether it be the things that you say to them, that's a decision. Whether it be the exercise that you give them, that's a decision. Whether it be how you load them, whether it's a push on that day, okay, put on 5 kilos, whether it's a pull day. These are all decisions that have a risk and reward element to them. So if I put on 5 kilos, the reward is that potentially you get stronger, and the reward of that is you might perform better for whatever reason. If I put it on, though, however, I'm pushing your capacity, and that is part of the process, but there's a risk side to that. So if I put that 5 kilos on, and then you are fatigued, and then you go into training the next day and you have a bad day of it, and you don't get selected for the game, I've made a stupid decision. So even the things down to the content of the words that I give an athlete, it's happened before where I asked an athlete to do something in one way, and that went against what the surgeon told them. Their confidence in me as a coach went down the drain, even though what I said was absolutely the right thing to say. It just went against what she previously heard from the surgeon that was 2 years ago. So it's funny that pretty much everything we do is the decision, which is, part of the process, really.
Yeah. And I'm curious too, then, has that ever negatively impacted a relationship that you've had with the client? I assume that you have to be really building strong trust with these people because you are making huge kind of life decisions for them in a way, right?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of trust at the start. And unfortunately, with that athlete, that she had an ACL, and the doctor told her that she would never really jump again. And I, as part of a progression scheme, asked her to do a very low level jump, and it was absolutely right for all the data told me. But that was a oversight, which then led to that trust essentially going, okay, this athlete, and there's 2 ways you can look at it. You go, okay, maybe that was probably an oversight for himself, and I needed to understand the situation a little bit more. Or you go, well, maybe this isn't the best relationship for us, because it has to work both ways. This is how we do things. Not that I'm going to force you to jump on board with that, but we need to have a conversation about progression with you and breaking down those barriers. But for sure, one of the most important things you can have with an athlete is trust, because we talked about decisions, they need to trust in the decision you're making is in their best interest. And you need to tell them what the risk of the decision is. You need to tell them what the reward of the decision is. So not everything is just going to be great. So I might say to an athlete, okay, we got a 3-week camp coming up, or a 3-week off season coming up. I'm going to put you in an absolute ditch. You're going to come in, you're going to hate me, we're going to put you through some pretty intense training. Your mood is going to be all over the place. You might be irritable. Your scores are going to go down. I'm just letting you know that. You might be at a slightly higher risk, so we might need to manage certain things around your training. But once you get out of that, because you're going on holiday for 2 weeks, you're going to be in a much better position. But I can only have that conversation with the athlete if they trust me in the first place. And that comes from repeated experience of them seeing things that work. So you can gain trust by me and you working together and seeing it over time. You can have trust because I've worked with people who get to where you want to get to. Have trust in me because I'm an unbelievable athlete myself. And all those ways are ways to gain trust, but it just depends. Some athletes, find value in certain routes versus others. So if you have never coached an elite athlete before, some people then go, well, I'm not going to work. Even though the content and every decision we make is absolutely scientific and backed, and you deliver it in a good way, but the nature of your experience is gonna fall short. So again, it's learning about what that athlete's motivations are and going, right, this training that we're doing, this is based on the work that this coach done, and this coach worked with that athlete. So you almost circumvent your failings as a coach per se, but you build trust in other ways.
And I think that's a really good overview, especially for, you know, for all of it, but for the combat sports, I think it's just so interesting the dynamics that are at play there, and, how big trust plays a role.
Yeah.
And I imagine that you're developing these relationships over years, right? It takes time. Or have you been thrown into something and you're like, okay, I have 2 months to really get this person to listen to me and take my suggestions? Have you ever been in a situation like
All of
that?
them. Yeah, all of the above, really. So we might get athletes who come to us, especially combat guys who, for whatever reason, they decided to move cities and they come to Liverpool and they need to then maybe want SEC support, and you just have to build that up very quickly because they've got a fight coming up in 10 weeks and it needs to happen. But typically, the thing with combat guys is they're either all in or they're all out. Like once they commit to it, they're in, because there's such a culture of the coach. You don't talk back to the coach, because if you do, you're going to have a hard time. So there is some natural born respect there. But in other sports, it's really, really difficult. From sports that, maybe more precision-based sports, which don't value strength and conditioning very much, or sports that typically have a culture of not engaging with strength and conditioning, it takes so long. It takes absolutely so long. And it might take a year, it might take 2 years for them to finally come along to, okay, no, I actually haven't been injured in 2 years. And you're like, oh no, I know. This stuff works. It's weird that I keep saying to athletes, it's weird that this stuff works. It's almost like we know what we're talking about. And then over time that builds and that builds and it builds. But I think again it goes back to, can you sell the product that you're giving the athletes? Because if you were just to rely on blind trust, well, that's not a really good platform for you to build that relationship on. So it's always about communicating. It's always about why you're doing things that we're doing, educating the athletes so they can start to understand why what they're doing is important. So they might see something that someone else is doing and go, oh no, I know, even though they're a high level athlete, I know that's really that beneficial. And that's a really nice position to get into, because you're going, okay, now I'm going to get it. Now.
Right. Is there anything else that maybe we missed that you wanted to make sure we touch on?
No, I think that's everything. Obviously, thanks for the opportunity to speak with yourself today. I've really enjoyed it. Hopefully the listener can get something from the chat.
Yeah, I think so. I think this was a great overview on the topic. So, yeah, thank you so much. This has been Board Certified, hosted by Cassandra from Achievable with Conor Heeney. And Achievable has great online courses for the USMLE Step 1, MCAT, PTCE, MPTE, CSCS, and others. You can try them out for free at achievable.me.